What are some of the most powerful forces controlling human life are the ones people almost never notice? Not kings, not armies, but institutions that quietly define what counts as normal, sane, healthy, or criminal. Michel Foucault spent his life investigating these hidden systems of power, exploring prisons, hospitals, schools, and even ideas about sexuality to understand how societies shape the way people think about themselves. His work would completely change how historians and philosophers understand power in the modern world. Michel Foucault was born in 1926 in the city of Poitiers in western France, into a family that expected him to follow a very traditional path. His father was a respected surgeon, and for generations the men in the family had practiced medicine. From the beginning, there was an unspoken assumption that the young boy would eventually enter the same profession. Medicine promised stability, prestige, and a clear role within society. Yet the child growing up in that quiet provincial city was already developing a mind that would question the very structures of authority and knowledge that society took for granted. His early years unfolded during a turbulent period in European history. When he was still a teenager, France was occupied during the Second World War. German forces controlled large parts of the country, and daily life changed dramatically. Schools continued to operate, but the atmosphere of uncertainty and political tension was impossible to ignore. The experience of growing up during wartime exposed him to the fragility of social order and the power that political systems could exert over ordinary life. Despite the expectations of his family, he gradually became drawn toward literature, philosophy, and psychology rather than medicine. His intellectual abilities were strong, and teachers quickly recognized his unusual intensity and curiosity. Eventually, he left Poitiers to pursue higher education in Paris, where he entered one of the most demanding academic environments in France. Paris, after the war, was filled with intellectual energy. Philosophers, writers, and political thinkers gathered in universities and cafes to debate ideas about freedom, history, and the future of society. Existentialist thinkers were questioning the nature of human freedom, while others were exploring how language, culture, and power shape human understanding. The atmosphere encouraged deep questioning of institutions that earlier generations had accepted without hesitation. At the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, he encountered a rigorous philosophical education that pushed students to confront difficult intellectual problems. The institution had produced many of France's leading thinkers, and the competition among students was intense. It was here that he began studying philosophy seriously, immersing himself in the works of earlier thinkers while also exploring psychology and the emerging social sciences. During these years, he struggled personally with questions about identity and belonging. The pressures of academic life were demanding, and his personality was often described as intense and deeply reflective. He spent long hours studying and thinking about the structures that shape human thought itself. Rather than focusing only on abstract philosophical arguments, he became fascinated by the institutions that organize society. Hospitals, prisons, schools, and mental asylums began attracting his attention. These institutions did more than simply perform practical functions. They also defined what counted as normal behavior and what was considered deviant or abnormal. Who decides what is madness and what is sanity? Who determines which behaviors deserve punishment and which deserve treatment? These questions became central to his intellectual curiosity. One of the first major areas he explored was the history of mental illness. Modern societies often treat madness as a medical condition requiring treatment within hospitals or psychiatric institutions. Yet he began wondering whether this understanding had always existed. Was madness always defined in the same way throughout history? Or had societies interpreted it differently at different times? To answer this question, he turned to historical research, examining how earlier centuries had treated individuals considered insane. The results challenged many assumptions. In earlier periods of European history, people labeled as mad were not always confined to specialized institutions. Their presence existed more visibly within everyday life. But beginning in the 17th century, Large numbers of individuals who were considered socially disruptive were gradually confined within institutions. This process, sometimes described as the Great Confinement, brought together people who had very different conditions. Individuals considered mentally ill, the poor, criminals, and others who did not fit social expectations were often placed within the same facilities. These institutions did not simply treat illness. They also enforced social order by separating certain individuals from the rest of society. Through this research, he began developing a broader insight about the relationship between knowledge and power. The way societies classify people are never entirely neutral. Systems of knowledge often emerge alongside systems of control. When institutions define categories such as normal, abnormal, sane, or criminal, they also influence how individuals are treated within society. This perspective would become one of the central themes of his work. Instead of assuming that knowledge develops purely through objective discovery, he examined how social structures shape the production of knowledge itself. Scientific theories, medical classifications, and legal systems all arise within particular historical contexts. In other words, knowledge is never completely separate from power. Institutions that claim authority over knowledge often play a role in organizing society and guiding behavior. Understanding this connection between knowledge and power would become the foundation for one of the most influential bodies of philosophical work in the 20th century. As his historical research deepened, he began developing a distinctive method of studying the past that differed from traditional historical approaches. Most historians attempted to trace a continuous story of progress, showing how ideas gradually improved or evolved over time. But he suspected that history was far less smooth and orderly than these narratives suggested. Instead of a steady progression toward truth, the development of knowledge often involved abrupt changes in how societies understood reality. Rather than asking whether modern ideas were more correct than earlier ones, he focused on a different question. How do certain ways of thinking become accepted as truth in the first place? Why do particular systems of knowledge dominate during certain periods of history while others disappear? To answer these questions, he began examining the underlying rules that shape what people within a society are able to think, say, and believe. This approach led him to study large historical shifts in fields such as medicine, science, and the human sciences. During the 18th and 19th centuries, for example, European societies began developing new institutions designed to observe, classify, and manage individuals. Hospitals became centers for the systematic study of disease. Schools began organizing students through structured educational programs. Prisons developed new methods of discipline intended not simply to punish criminals, but to reform their behavior. At first glance, these institutions appeared to represent humanitarian progress. Modern societies were replacing older systems of punishment or neglect with organized systems that aimed to educate, treat, and rehabilitate individuals. Yet he believed that something more complex was taking place beneath the surface. These institutions also introduced new forms of observation and control. Patients in hospitals were carefully examined and categorized according to medical diagnoses. Students in schools were monitored, tested, and evaluated according to educational standards. Prisoners were subjected to routines designed to reshape their habits and behavior. In each case, individuals became objects of systematic observation. Through this process, knowledge about human behavior expanded dramatically. Doctors collected detailed records about illnesses, educators developed theories about learning, and criminologists attempted to understand the psychology of criminal behavior. But this growing body of knowledge also strengthened the authority of the institutions that produced it. The connection between knowledge and power became increasingly clear in his analysis. Institutions that claimed expertise about human behavior gained the authority to define what counted as normal or abnormal, healthy or unhealthy, acceptable or deviant. These definitions did not simply describe reality. They actively shaped how individuals were treated within society. One of his most famous historical studies explored the development of modern prison systems. For centuries, punishment had often been brutal and highly visible. Public executions and physical torture were used to demonstrate the power of rulers and discourage crime through fear. But by the 19th century, many societies began replacing these methods with prisons designed to isolate and discipline individuals over long periods of time. This shift appeared more humane on the surface. Physical torture was gradually reduced, and the goal of punishment was increasingly described as rehabilitation rather than revenge. Yet he argued that the new prison system introduced a more subtle and pervasive form of control. Instead of relying on dramatic displays of violence, modern institutions began shaping behavior through constant observation and regulation. Prisoners followed strict daily schedules. Their movements were monitored, their activities recorded, and their behavior evaluated by authorities who claimed expertise in managing criminal behavior. To illustrate this transformation, he examined an architectural design proposed in the 18th century known as the panopticon. The structure consisted of a circular prison where a central watchtower could observe all the cells surrounding it. The prisoners could never know exactly when they were being watched, yet the possibility of constant observation encouraged them to regulate their own behavior. This design fascinated him because it symbolized a broader principle that extended far beyond prisons. Modern societies increasingly relied on systems of observation that encouraged individuals to monitor themselves. Surveillance did not always require direct force. The awareness that one might be watched often became enough to shape behavior. Schools, factories, hospitals, and military institutions adopted similar principles of discipline and observation. Through examinations, records, and evaluations, individuals were continuously measured and compared against standards of normal behavior. These processes created powerful incentives for people to conform to social expectations. His analysis suggested that power in modern societies operates differently from the traditional image of authority imposed by kings or governments alone. Instead of appearing only in dramatic acts of domination, power often circulates through everyday institutions and practices. It shapes how people think about themselves, how they behave, and how they understand their place within society. This insight had profound implications for understanding modern life. Rather than viewing power as something possessed only by political leaders, he argued that power operates through networks of institutions, knowledge systems, and social practices. Doctors, teachers, psychologists, and administrators all participate in systems that influence how individuals are categorized and managed. At the same time, he did not believe that individuals were completely powerless within these systems. Because power operates through social relationships, it also creates spaces for resistance. People constantly negotiate, challenge, and reinterpret the rules that govern their lives. Through this work, he transformed how many scholars understood the relationship between knowledge, institutions, and social control. Instead of seeing modern society simply as a story of progress toward freedom and rationality, he revealed a more complicated picture in which systems of knowledge and systems of power evolve together, shaping the ways human beings understand themselves and the world around them. As his work gained attention across Europe and the United States, he gradually became one of the most influential thinkers of the late 20th century. Universities began inviting him to lecture, and scholars from many different fields started exploring the implications of his ideas. Historians, sociologists, political theorists, and literary critics all found something valuable in his approach to understanding how knowledge and power interact within society. Yet despite his growing reputation, he did not see himself as constructing a single grand philosophical system. In fact, he often resisted being labeled simply as a philosopher. Instead, he described his work as a form of historical investigation that attempted to reveal how certain ideas and institutions emerge and gain authority over time. His goal was not to produce a universal theory explaining everything, but to examine specific historical developments in order to show how they shape the way people think and behave. During the 1970s, his research began shifting toward a new area that would become central to his later work: After studying institutions such as prisons, hospitals, and schools, he became increasingly interested in how societies regulate the most personal aspects of human life. Questions about sexuality, morality, and personal identity began to occupy his attention. At first glance, sexuality might appear to be a purely private matter, something belonging to the intimate life of individuals. Yet he suspected that even this deeply personal area of life had been shaped by powerful historical forces. Societies throughout history have established rules about sexual behavior, defined categories of acceptable and unacceptable relationships, and developed institutions that monitor these norms. The traditional view often suggested that earlier societies had been more repressive, while modern societies had gradually become more open and liberated. According to this narrative, the 19th century was a time when sexual topics were suppressed, hidden behind strict moral codes that discouraged open discussion. But his research revealed a more complex picture. Instead of silence about sexuality, he discovered that modern societies had actually produced an enormous amount of discussion about it. Doctors, psychologists, teachers, priests, and legal authorities all developed specialized knowledge about sexual behavior. Books, medical studies, and educational materials analyzed sexual habits in extraordinary detail. This explosion of discourse suggested that sexuality had become a subject of intense observation and analysis. Rather than simply repressing sexuality, modern societies had created systems designed to examine and classify it. New categories of identity began appearing, defining individuals according to particular forms of desire or behavior. One of the most significant examples involved the emergence of the concept of sexual identity. Earlier societies might have condemned certain behaviors, but modern institutions increasingly began defining individuals themselves according to those behaviors. Categories such as the homosexual or the heterosexual gradually became identities through which people understood themselves. This shift represented a profound transformation in how societies organized knowledge about human life. By creating new categories of identity, institutions also gained new ways of regulating behavior. Medicine, psychology, and law all played roles in defining what counted as normal or abnormal sexuality. He described this process using the concept of power operating through knowledge rather than through simple repression. Power did not function only by forbidding certain actions. It also worked by producing knowledge that shaped how individuals understood themselves. When institutions define categories of identity, those definitions can influence how people think about their own desires, relationships, and possibilities. His analysis suggested that modern power operates in subtle ways that extend deeply into everyday life. Instead of relying primarily on direct force, societies often guide behavior through systems of knowledge that encourage individuals to interpret themselves according to certain frameworks. This perspective transformed debates about freedom and authority. Traditional political theories often focused on the power of governments or laws. But his work showed that power also operates through social norms, scientific classifications, and cultural expectations that appear natural or obvious. The implications of these ideas reached far beyond academic philosophy. Activists, social movements, and scholars began using his work to examine how institutions influence issues such as gender roles, medical practices, and cultural norms. His analysis provided tools for questioning assumptions that had long been treated as natural or inevitable. At the same time, he remained deeply engaged with political and social debates of his era. The decades after the Second World War were marked by intense struggles over civil rights, political authority, and personal freedom. Many people were questioning traditional institutions and searching for new ways to understand power within modern society. He often participated in public discussions about prison reform, human rights, and the treatment of marginalized individuals. These activities reflected his belief that intellectual work should not remain isolated within universities. Ideas about power and knowledge had real consequences for how societies treat their members. Throughout this period, he continued writing and teaching while refining his historical investigations. His work increasingly explored how individuals form relationships with themselves within different cultural contexts. Instead of seeing identity as something fixed or predetermined, he examined how people actively shape their lives through the practices and norms available within their societies. These reflections represented the beginning of the final stage of his intellectual journey, where questions about ethics, self-understanding, and human freedom would become central to his exploration of how individuals navigate the complex structures of power that surround them. As his work moved into its final phase during the late 1970s and early 1980s, his attention gradually shifted from institutions and social control toward a deeper question about how individuals shape their own lives within these systems. Earlier in his career, he had examined prisons, hospitals, and schools to show how modern societies organize knowledge and discipline behavior. Now he became increasingly interested in how individuals understand themselves and actively participate in forming their own identities. This new direction led him to explore the long history of ethics and self-reflection in Western civilization. Rather than focusing only on modern institutions, he began studying ancient Greek and Roman writings that examined how individuals were expected to live their lives. Philosophers in the ancient world had often asked questions not only about truth and knowledge, but also about the art of living. They were interested in how individuals could cultivate discipline, self-awareness, and balance in their personal conduct. What fascinated him was the idea that throughout history people have developed different practices for shaping their own behavior and identity. These practices might involve forms of reflection, rules for conduct, or ways of examining one's thoughts and desires. In ancient societies, such practices were often considered essential parts of ethical life. Individuals were encouraged to examine themselves, control their impulses, and develop character through deliberate effort. This historical perspective revealed that ideas about morality and identity have never been fixed or universal. Each society creates its own frameworks for understanding what it means to live well. By studying these different traditions, he hoped to show that modern individuals are not simply trapped within rigid systems of power. Even within structured institutions, people can still reflect on how they understand themselves and how they choose to live. The final volumes of his work explored how societies throughout history have treated subjects such as sexuality, relationships, and personal discipline. Rather than assuming that modern views represent the final stage of progress, he examined how earlier civilizations approached these questions in very different ways. Ancient thinkers often treated ethics as a form of self-cultivation, where individuals actively shaped their character through reflection and practice. This approach emphasized personal responsibility and self-awareness rather than strict obedience to universal rules. Individuals were expected to develop their own understanding of how to live responsibly within their communities. The idea that life itself could be shaped as a kind of ethical project fascinated him deeply. These reflections connected back to the central theme that had guided his work for decades: the relationship between knowledge, power, and human freedom. While institutions influence behavior and define social categories, individuals are not merely passive objects within these systems. People interpret the norms around them, challenge certain expectations, and sometimes transform the way societies understand identity and morality. Throughout his career, he had shown how power operates through institutions, language, and systems of knowledge. But in his later writings, he emphasized that human beings also possess the capacity to reflect on these systems and reshape their relationship to them. Freedom does not necessarily mean escaping all forms of influence. Instead, it may involve becoming aware of the forces that shape our thinking and choosing how we respond to them. During these years, he continued teaching and lecturing in France and abroad. His classes often attracted large audiences of students who were fascinated by the originality of his historical investigations. Unlike many philosophers who focus primarily on abstract arguments, he used detailed historical research to reveal how ideas about truth, normality, and identity develop within specific cultural contexts. His influence spread far beyond philosophy departments. Historians, sociologists, political theorists, and scholars in literature and cultural studies began using his ideas to examine the structures that shape modern societies. His work encouraged researchers to question assumptions that had once seemed obvious or natural. In the early 1980s, he continued writing and traveling while completing the final stages of his research on the history of ethics and self-formation. Despite decades of intense intellectual activity, his curiosity remained strong. He continued exploring new historical sources and examining how societies construct ideas about truth, identity, and responsibility. Michel Foucault died in 1984 at the age of 57. Although his life ended relatively early, the influence of his work continued growing after his death. Scholars across the world began applying his ideas to new fields of research, examining how power and knowledge shape areas ranging from medicine and education to media, politics, and cultural identity. What made his work especially powerful was the way it encouraged people to question assumptions that had long gone unnoticed. Institutions that appear neutral or purely scientific often carry hidden forms of authority. Categories that seem natural may actually have been constructed through historical processes. By uncovering these hidden structures, his work revealed how deeply social systems influence the ways individuals understand themselves and others. Yet his philosophy did not simply portray human beings as victims of overwhelming forces. Instead, it invited readers to reflect on their own relationship to the systems that surround them. If knowledge and power shape the frameworks through which people interpret the world, then understanding those frameworks becomes an important step toward greater awareness. The intellectual journey that began in a provincial French town eventually transformed how scholars around the world study history, society, and human identity. Through his investigations of prisons, medicine, sexuality, and ethics, he demonstrated that ideas about truth and normality are always connected to the structures of power that organize societies. His work leaves behind a lasting challenge. If knowledge is never completely separate from power, then every society must constantly examine the assumptions it treats as obvious. The task of critical thought is not simply to accept inherited truths, but to question how those truths were created and whose interests they serve. In this way, the exploration of power, knowledge, and self-understanding continues long after his own life came to an end.